So the reason that I bring up Dr. Faustus on almost every episode we do is that it has become the framework through which I understand all other art, especially power dynamics between characters, because Mephistopheles, very traditionally, is the arbiter of temptation. He seduces Faustus to get his soul, but then there's something lingering after that contract is signed. And the play explores that in such a provocative, beautiful fashion, up until the very moment that payment comes due and Faustus is dragged down to hell. Almost all of those same beats and plot points are represented in Wall Street, and it's against this fantastic, greedy, nasty, amoral underpinning of the 80s and the excesses of power broker, big chunky suit, big haired, miserable hairspray kind of culture of the 80s. It's Charlie Sheen. He's the young greed, basically, joining up into this evil empire of stock and bond and debt trading. And he goes bad. He compromises himself, tries to develop a conscience at the last moment, and it's too late. So bye-bye, he goes to jail. But there is that underpinning of romance that I think sells so much of both of these stories. For example, the contract signing in Faustus is something that's very overt. In the same way, honestly, I mean, this is sort of a sidebar, but in the same way, most of the first 50 Shades of Grey movie is them negotiating a contract. That's also a Faustus story. Different episode. In Wall Street, we don't see any overt contract signing because this is a slower seduction than that. This is the young stockbroker quietly giving up on all of his principles, quietly convincing himself that these indulgences are worth giving up everything that he learned growing up. We see his sort of tension with his father when the old morals confront his new reality. So there isn't one moment where he gives himself over. It's a much slower, more nuanced seduction. And playing that against the wealthiest restaurants and the beautiful penthouses and the gorgeous, impossible luxury of New York, especially at this time, heightens the story and brings the romance to the fore. It really pulls a lot of the beauty and the commentary of Faustus by adapting it. In the same way, so many Shakespeare adaptations play with the setting, and if you set it in a more militarized context, you get something totally different out of the text. These plays, and the reason I talk about Faustus so much, is that the plays are so malleable. There is so much there that works in so many settings, with so many casting choices in so many eras after centuries and centuries of these plays being talked about, these ideas of power and greed and masculinity and vulnerability being played with. There's so much to pull out of them. Another 500 years, we're not going to get half of it. And this impossibly modern story, even if it's almost 40 years old now, it really puts an interesting new lens up to a story that I consider absolutely eternal to understanding art and character. So let's go into some of the similarities here. Charlie Sheen is Bud Fox. He's our Faustus character, and I like that they, both have F in the last name there. Michael Douglas is Mephistopheles, and that is Gordon Gekko. This relationship is expanded and shifted a little bit to be much more of a pseudo-father figure. I feel like in Marlowe's play it's more of a brotherly thing, but here it's much more of a father dynamic. There's a stark age gap here, and Michael Douglas, I mean, apparently he was smoking 40 cigarettes a day when they did this first movie. There's kind of like a weariness on his face. He's got way more lines on his face than Martin Sheen does, who plays Charlie Sheen's character's father here. I'll just call him the Faustus character. His father seems younger than the Mephistopheles character, so there really is a father figure dynamic here. And it's not a retired father. They're shifting the age dynamic because in Dr. Faustus is an old man. He's a retired theologian. And here, the Faustus character is a very young stockbroker. So there's a naivete that comes with that youth. And the father figure, who you'd think could easily slot into that role of the older man, the retired whatever, It's not. The Mephistopheles character is a very active, powerful influence here. They're in the same business. I mean, kind of, this is sort of a jokey thing here. In the same way, Faustus and Mephistopheles, being the theologian and the demon, are both in the theology business. Here you have Bud Fox and Gordon Gekko both in the stock trade. So there's an interesting kind of mentor dynamic built in where their occupation is very, very central to their identities. I want to take a second to talk about this too. We know there are a million other stock traders in the same way we know there are a million other demons in Doctor Faustus. But this movie really plays up something that has only ever kind of read in between the lines of the play for me, which is that Mephistopheles is only one of a billion demons in hell who has to go out and find souls to seduce and bully or hoodwink into contracts. He's a collector of souls, but he's not Satan. He is not at the top of the food chain. And similarly, I mean, half of this movie is you meeting different stockbrokers, so you know Gordon Gekko's not the top dog. You know he's up there, but there are so many other ones that every act of evil that any individual stockbroker perpetrates in this film, you immediately multiply 1,000-fold in your head because you know this whole industry is this corrupt and evil. And I feel like that's a really effective metaphor or shorthand for the enormity and eternity of hell and heaven. It's a really interesting way to use economics to talk about philosophy. And I really don't care if any of this was intentional on the writers or directors' parts. It's an interesting way that helps me understand the movie and the play better. So if Gordon Gekko isn't just Mephistopheles, if he's a really, really proficient stockbroker/demon, then there are moments in this movie where he is positioned as Satan, where he is positioned as the top of the food chain. And I think there's one specific example that can kind of show what I mean here. There is a woman that the Faustus character, Charlie Sheen's Faustus character, chases throughout here. And there are moments where she feels like Helen of Troy does in Doctor Faustus, where she is basically a creation from Mephistopheles that is sent down to tempt Faustus and kind of sell him on this deal, to show him the possibilities that demons and heaven and hell can offer him if he takes the right side. And here, Darian is the woman's name. She is sent to Charlie Sheen's character the first time by Gordon Gekko. So it's very similar to Mephistopheles. I mean, there are some interpretations of Dr. Faustus where Mephistopheles is Helen of Troy, and he's just kind of projecting himself to look like her, which adds to that kind of homoeroticism and like the sexuality of the control that he wants over Faustus. You could also view Darian, if you're casting Gordon Gekko as more of a Satan figure than just a lowly Mephistopheles-level figure, is that she becomes, you can factor her in to Lucifer's one scene during Dr. Faustus where he's actually on stage and he leads this parade of the 7 deadly sins kind of in front of Faustus, showing him the possibilities and wonders of hell. And you could recast Darian as the symbol of lust there, as another form of the temptation that she comes to represent in the story. And either way you read it, you're capturing the strange sexuality of this scene, where you have the Faustus character lusting after a woman, but it's not really a woman. It's a pawn. I mean, Darian is barely developed as her own character. She's very much a pawn of both Gordon Gekko and Bud Fox. So if you translate that into the Faustus language, this is a woman who has slept with both men, which plays perfectly into the reading of Faustus that Helen of Troy really is Mephistopheles projecting himself into this avatar that Faustus finds attractive. Mephistopheles is the wish fulfiller. He is the architect of Faustus's fantasies, and by some readings, he's even directly involved in those fantasies. I mean, it really doesn't matter which way you read this. It becomes more and more complicated and incestuous, and every different take brings these characters closer together. And the theme is always Mephistopheles demanding control over Faustus. And of course, both the play and the movie are told from the Faustus character's perspective. Charlie Sheen is he is our eyeball character through this movie. In the same way, Faustus is in almost every scene of the play, and we don't really see Mephistopheles on his own from his own perspective in either story. But that thing that was lingering under the surface that I mentioned earlier, the idea that there are so many demons in hell that are out trying to lock down souls to bring back home, that idea of Gekko finding these young stockbrokers and bringing them into the fold and making them work for him, there's another side to that. You can play it for a while where the new Faustus character is the chosen one, right? He has the attention of the all-controlling, attractive, mysterious, wish fulfillment character. This is not Mephistopheles' whole story. He has been at this forever. And the downfall of the Faustus character in Wall Street is the realization that the Mephistopheles character is playing a much longer game. So Gordon Gekko betrays Bud Fox basically by having other games. He has other deals and angles and stocks that he has to pump and get rid of. And as the movie finally explores the enormity of that it doesn't matter how much money he had to cut to just get out of this situation, there are countless souls out there to be tempted and cashed. The Mephistopheles character is always looking for more. And of course, there's a desensitized nature to that. I mean, to us, it seems incredibly callous. But of course, the longer you're in that job, the longer you're in a soulless predatory job like being a stockbroker, the more desensitized you're going to get to the innocents you're corrupting, to the souls that you're stealing. I mean, you see how the metaphor works here. And there are even lines that Michael Douglas delivers so well. Later in the movie, he says things like, "I create nothing, I own." Again, that could work just as well if you read him as Satan or if you read him as Mephistopheles. It's the collector, that like kleptomaniac mindset that has absolutely no room to consider the humanity or priorities of the vessels that he's putting up there on the shelf. So the climax of the movie is Bud Fox. I mean, we're pursuing that mentor idea where Gordon Gekko is training him up, and the climax of the movie is the Faustus character graduating to the point where he's challenging Mephistopheles at his own game and trying to outfox him. And for a moment there, during their final confrontation, it looks like the Faustus character has won. And Mephistopheles here reacts by calling him a gay slur that I don't want to repeat on the podcast. It just read immediately to me as a nod to the weird complexity and flirtation of their relationship, the dominance and control that these men are fighting for the entire runtime of the movie, in exactly the same way Faustus and Mephistopheles fight over that for the whole run of Marlowe's play. Using a gay slur there, in this hyper-competitive, masculine, performative world of 80s stockbrokers, absolutely plays to the homoeroticism of the original play. It makes it crude and derogatory, kind of violent and modern, by using this like twisted ugliness of dragging out their subtext and weaponizing it as a slur against him. It breaks their relationship, basically. It's too overt, it's too nasty. I mean, if you blow up the subtext of any relationship, it's difficult to go back to small talk in the elevator, right? At this exact moment where we weaponize the only underlying humanity that these characters share, and their kind of weird pseudo-reliance and love for each other, when you break that, it's in terms of who's going to win. This thing needs a victor, and who is going to win? And it seems like Gordon Gekko has won. The Mephistopheles character has pulled out all the stops, and ultimately he's won. It's at this exact moment that we miss the point of what winning means in this story. In the world of Wall Street, winning would mean becoming the better trader of stocks, the better demon, the better soul collector. These are not prizes that are enviable. And this is where maybe the last twist of the movie comes in, where we find out that Charlie Sheen's character was wearing a wire. And now he's just gotten Michael Douglas's character's confession, basically, to insider trading and breaking the law. And this repositions Gordon Gekko, the Mephistopheles character of Wall Street, as not the biggest fish in the world. He's not the devil. He's not Satan. He is Mephistopheles. I think this is sort of a righting of the ship that brings it back to the traditional structure of a Faustus fable, where there is a bigger force. In the world of Faustus, there is God. That's the biggest force in the story, and he's the one who wins out at the end. In the world of Wall Street, it's the great symbol of accountability that the movie leaves off on as the Faustus character is driven to the courthouse. I mean, he says out loud, Charlie Sheen says out loud that he thinks he's going to go to jail now. And this is presented as accountability on sort of this mortal coil. I would argue that this is paying off the last-ditch attempt that Faustus has in the last couple scenes of the play, where he tries to sign a new contract with God to turn against the devil and try to right the ship here. And in the world of Wall Street, because the bigger fish that they're throwing the justice system, the legal system, they're throwing that as like the mortal god here, right, of accountability. They are not as clean or morally pure as maybe Marlowe's god was. So they eagerly take the deal. He wears the wire and he signs that new contract with them. There's that new subterfuge, and he becomes a pawn of an even bigger player than Gordon Gekko. So in the end, Wall Street has a similar kind of victory for God that Doctor Faustus does, where ultimately Faustus is punished for his sins. The kind of order of the world and the afterlife is restored, and justice wins at the end, which is why I'm calling this a fable, because I think that's how Faustus is positioned in all great Faustus stories that follow. Well, it's how most of them end. And you'll notice there's not a satisfaction here. I'm not saying that this story converted me to be a proud Christian any more than Marlowe's did. I think the critiques of these various systems exist regardless of the ending. And this is why I love Faustus so much, because I don't see it as any sort of work of... It's not an evangelical story. It's not trying to sell you on a belief in God. It is exploring power dynamics. It's exploring the sexuality between these characters as much as it is a million fascinating philosophical and theological ideas. Having God win in the end, or having this mortal system of justice and retribution and fairness, or, the legal system, having that win at the end doesn't make you feel any better about the legal system than Dr. Faustus makes you feel good about God, because Marlowe has spent so much of his time making Faustus a sympathetic character. In the same way Bud Fox, Charlie Sheen's character, the Faustus character in Wall Street, he is by the end of the story, he is human and earnest and feels bad. So punishing him doesn't feel satisfying. The curveball of a great Faustus story is to have, quote-unquote, order restored by the end of it, to have God or whatever substitute figure or force you have in the story, to have that force be victorious, but that hollow feeling, that gap where it feels like you're walking downstairs and you missed a step, the hollowness that you feel in that last second as order is restored, that is the beauty and I think unique power of the Faustus fable. And it was pretty amazing to feel that in a story that up until like halfway through, when I realized what this was to me, I was like, wow, this really isn't as good as Wolf of Wall Street. But it's playing in that Faustus framework in a much more aggressive, fascinating way. Because there are moments where the characters seem aware of some of this ideology. The most famous speech from this movie is "Greed is good." That's kind of the apocryphal quote from this big Gordon Gekko speech. And greed is presented as the beacon of American capitalism. That's kind of the economic critique of the film. Greed is medicine for a failing company, economy, and country. It's presented as a form of natural selection or instinct. The characters, I mean, a bunch of evil, nasty stockbrokers, they are holding up greed as a beacon of self-interest and self-preservation that is natural and good, that has given them their livelihood. But it's not defensive. It's something that they're proud of. They're presenting it as this very natural, honorable, straightforward thing. Like it is, greed becomes a warped humanism in this story. It's ultimately vilified by the implicit critique of the entire film. But it's fascinating to watch these characters who are constantly labeled salesmen, and they all recoil at that label. It's amazing to watch them mask and sell this selfish, disgusting ideology as righteous and honorable. It's I think, a gesture at how open to manipulation philosophy is. I think as a field, I've never found anything more rewarding, but people will invoke higher principles as a fig leaf philosophy to justify or dress up whatever their particular ambitions happen to be. Look at every time the Republicans need to lean on rugged individualism. It's the exact same principle. But we see Charlie Sheen's Faustus character, we see his greed. This is sort of the benefit of a visual medium and the excesses of the 80s that this film is kind of skewering, because you see his suits get fancier. You see his haircut get more expensive. And that is exactly not the greed that we're talking about with Faustus. And this is, I think, where the comparison really becomes fruitful. Because Faustus's situation, if you're critiquing him for greed, it would only be the greed of knowledge. He's a retired theologian who makes a deal with the devil to get the secrets of the universe beyond the books in his study and at his university. So this greed of knowledge is about the universe and the Christian afterlife and the truth of the life universe and everything. It's very funny in like a quasi-theological subtext to call that like insider trading. That's very funny. But in no way is his desire harmful. It's not exploiting anyone. Wanting to know what happens after you die is the sort of knowledge that's desirable to everyone in human history. It's not the same as the unchecked greed of buying more and more expensive penthouses through Manhattan, like we see Charlie Sheen doing in the movie. If anything, the excesses of Wall Street make Faustus's plight even more sympathetic and basic. The trick that is so effective, I think, in Wall Street is that there are very few characters who can push Charlie Sheen's character back on course. There are very few checks and balances on the Faustus character as he falls to temptation here. And maybe the only beacon in that respect is Martin Sheen, Charlie Sheen's father, who plays his character's father. It's a fun bit of kind of stunt casting, but Martin Sheen is incredible as always. And if you've seen The West Wing, he's basically blue-collar Jed Bartlett. He is the voice of moral accountability. He is very, very much playing on the old man character and trope that was used in Faustus as much as it was popularized in a lot of Elizabethan theater. The old man character, if you've listened to our Lord of the Rings episodes, we talked about the old man trope constantly. At various points, it's thrown at Gandalf. It is embodied by Saruman and the White Rider. The old man character is a prophet who only appears occasionally and very pointedly, who has an overt moral voice. And the lesson that Martin Sheen's character communicates every single time he's on screen here is that family and community are the true antidote to the evils ailing his son, which is very much how the old man tries to reach out to Faustus as he gets deeper and deeper into Marlowe's play. He's trying to reach out to him from the perspective of the other theologians and the university and people who care about him. And the tragedy is sort of that Faustus is so isolated by that point that it doesn't mean anything. Charlie Sheen's character is similarly kind of numb to advice. The canary in the coal mine doesn't hit as hard because he's so overwhelmed by temptation and money and power and wealth and real estate and women and all this, the way that the 80s are represented in this money-hungry culture that we see in this movie. It's a really interesting precursor to a movie that would, or a book that would come out 4 years after this film, which we've mentioned on the show before, American Psycho. And Patrick Bateman, who's the lead of that story, and that's a much more pointed skewering of this era. It's much more violent and over the top. It's an extremely dark comedy, and that character is even more disillusioned and isolated and greedy and nasty. And in both stories, if there was someone they trusted, a friend, a family member who could reach out to them, it would have helped. It's the same way Faustus reads as an incredibly lonely character, because the only guy who reaches out to him doesn't even seem to have much of an impact. Throughout the 5 acts of Marlowe's play, we never talk about a family. There's very little that is mooring him to the world, but there's a constant suggestion or gap in the story that someone in that position would make all the difference. And if you look at American Psycho, Patrick Bateman has a brother who he has almost no relationship with. They're kind of just, he's a shallow memory that he has. And there's even a suggestion that Patrick's father was evil, and he was kind of to blame for a lot of this. He owned the company where Patrick works, and there's an idea that he mentored him in the wrong direction. Here in Wall Street, you have Martin Sheen's character as absolute moral purity, the canary in the coal mine, the mentor in the right direction. And maybe that is the thing that pulls him at the last moment into that new contract with God that is then successful. Because in Faustus, when he tries to turn on Mephistopheles and turn to God at the 11th hour, it doesn't work and the demons show up and drag him down to hell. But here, there is some level of contrition. There is compassion for his family. There's a whole subplot about his father's airline company, which Gordon Gekko tries to basically hollow out and sell off. And that's the moment that breaks Charlie Sheen. And as the Faustus character in the story, he tries to turn hard. He sees something that matters more than himself and his priorities. And maybe that is what allows him that minorly happy ending. Because it's Martin Sheen's character, it's his father, this voice of reason, who's the one who drives him to the courthouse, this place of mortal accountability at the end of the story. And while he's driving the car, he's talking, and there is a gesture towards this opportunity, not just seeing it as a punishment, but seeing it as an opportunity to basically atone. He tells the Faustus character that maybe this was the best thing for him. And now he can create something with his life. He can pay his dues and go to prison, and then there's some opportunity for forgiveness. It's not just the lesson of punishment that feels so brutal and hollow and unfulfilling at the end of Doctor Faustus. In Wall Street, there's this olive branch of genuine humanity and kindness. It's not just the mean-spirited revenge of the demons dragging Faustus to hell that make you question whether or not Satan or God or the demons or any of these characters in this play are fair at all. That's the effect at the end of Dr. Faustus. But in Wall Street, you're comforted by the kindness and forgiveness, the humility, the humanity of Martin Sheen's character, of the Faustus character's father, of a family member helping and forgiving and trying to step in. And I think that leaves this story as much more hopeful, maybe, than I usually get from Faustus when I reread it. And I liked that as a twist, because you're setting it against this hopeless husk of New York background in the excesses of the 80s. I loved that it pivoted to something that felt so genuine and simple at the end, because that simple satisfaction is never on the table for Faustus in Marlowe's play. So yeah, that's Wall Street, the Oliver Stone movie from 1987. I really enjoyed watching this, and I was furiously writing up some little notes and comparisons on my phone. I hope it was somewhat comprehensible to you guys. I think I'm going to call this a little series, Faustus Fables is a good name. It rhymes. I guess alliteration is rhyming now. So yeah, this is the first Faustus fable I'm talking about directly. As these things pop up, or I reread other stories like, Frankenstein, that's a Faustus story. As I go through other Faustus stories, I will try to do more episodes like this on Tuesday. I'll bring Maggie in on some of them, but I talk about Faustus so much that until we do episodes on the play itself, I felt like I should give it a little more dedicated airtime. Second Breakfast Pod on TikTok and Instagram, secondbreakfastpod@gmail.com for your feedback and theories. We'll talk to you soon, and thank you as always for listening.